Hey, so welcome to our webinar, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I am Joke, your host for tonight's webinar, organized by the German Institute for Democracy and Development. We will be discussing the situation in the Sahel region in Africa in light of rising terrorism, fragile security, and increased clashes between Western agenda and other external players such as Russia, China, and the United Arab Emirates. Its importance has increased tremendously also for the European Union, afflicted by a combination of armed conflict, terrorism, extreme weather conditions, and economic instability. The region has been in the spotlight of international policy debates. The Sahel region is dry, hot, and vast, so it's very difficult to govern. That provides room for criminals who've trafficked people, weapons, and drugs for years. Every single day, thousands of people are being displaced in the Sahel. They're running away from violence perpetrated by extremist groups. And for today's topic, we are joined by Mr. Heinz Kurt Becker. He is an Austrian politician who served as a member of the European Parliament. He is a member of the Austrian People's Party, part of the European People's Party. Secondly, we have Felipe Pathe Duarte. He's an assistant professor and researcher at the Nova School of Law in Lisbon. Felipe is also a consultant and researcher at VisionWare. And then we have Carlos Uriarte. He's the Secretary General of Pan-Europa Spain. He's a member of the Council of the Presidency of the International Pan-European Union. And lastly, we have Nuno Wanon Martins. He's a political expert and senior advisor in European affairs. So without further ado, I'll now give the floor to the first speaker, Mr. Becker.
Mr. Becker is muted.
Now it should work. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Fine. Then thank you again, esteemed audience. Let me express my thanks for having organized this event for a vital topic and thank Nuno Wanon Martins and the Deutsche Institut für Demokratie und Entwicklung and the Instituto Friedman and my co-speakers for today. I think the topic on today's exchange is a vital topic that will determine the fate of all of us in the next times. Assuming that Europe will overcome the post-COVID-19 epoch within a few years, I understand these few years, to be best suited to develop and install a broad and deep-reaching multi-level cooperation pact, which I am convinced can push the developments of the next decades to the mutual benefits for generations. Thanks, first of all, for accepting my Austrian English, which I have made perfect in the last 10 years in the EU. So you apologize, please. Now to the topic. As a precondition for this pact, I have mentioned Europe has to treat Africa as a partner. It's very clear all other approaches are finished. We have to go the partnership way. And because of that, the non-national approach, this means that primarily this process should be carried by the European Union and the African Union, advised by invited institutions such as ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, or similar. In a parallel strategy to this forming the future's Europe-Africa Pact, the EU is strongly advised to negotiate about a much larger than ever before military presence and peacekeeping troops together with or under the United Nations command, primarily to establish buffer zones and regions for protecting civil population. Of course, also to combat terrorist groups. But for the confidence of the national governments there, I think the combating is not the number one topic for the next starting phase. Of course, such a great military project will need quite high budgets and resources. But frankly speaking, I see no other way to step by step limit and reduce the killing and destabilizing in various regions by Boko Haram, Islamic states in Greater Sahara, Janim, and Al-Qaeda. It would be very helpful, of course, if we could form an alliance with Arabian Islamic states to become part of these actions. Let me express my conviction that not thinking in military terms would be irresponsible, because it's connected with a great loss of valuable time periods. Back to the concept of Europe-Africa Pact. It shall at least base on at least 3 pillars I want to define, which realization might happen even on different levels and in different speeds. This would make such pillar realization more manageable anyway, because this might become a mega project. Pillar number 1, I describe as an education offensive. It should aim for as well increase the skills potential in African regions, as well as giving hope to those who eventually can get vocational training according to European needs to be at some moment accepted in the EU on basis of the blue card. Generally speaking, this could be some idea also to regulate migration in a legal way. During the last period of the European Parliament, I was also a member of the Special Committee Combating Terrorism. And I have learned a lot of the interdependencies of radical Islam and terrorism in Europe. Everybody knows. But this radical Islamism is also part of the African troubles and challenges. Yes, with different effects, but it is the radical Islamism which is causing such situations. So in my understanding, Europe must act against these roots of terrorism, but I prefer this acting totally independent to the key item of my contribution of today, which is the project for a Europe-Africa Pact. It should be a separate level of action. The before named first pillar of the Education Office is the most important. As I said, it could even reduce irregular migration on the long run. Second pillar is economic cooperation and support. Briefly, I am favoring models very near to a Marshall Plan with Africa. And I had experienced in feasibility studies that estimates on any comparable projects to this US Marshall Plan, which was the historic model, showed a very quite realistic result. Of course, you must understand such an idea under comparable conditions, Many people do not know what I have learned by experts and scientists in a conference I had organized in the European Parliament in May 2016. And I could learn that USA, and in our example now, Europe must keep the full control and must have the say how financial aid is invested in any region of Africa in order to avoid corruption and misuse regionally by the administrations there. This was never done like that in the past. This was also one of the keys of the US Marshall Plan. The best way should be EU offices who can at the same time not only control but help regional initiatives and entrepreneurs and SMEs applying for project funding. The same system was practiced by the USA in the after World War II times very successfully. The ERP funds, as it, for instance, exists in Austria, the European Recovery Program Fund, is still existing. And it is still under US control, 60 years later. And it balanced last year with a plus of 3 billion euro in Austria only. It is still offering very fine loans to our industry and economy and research. The focus today is not so much the big industry as it was after the war. No, it's the group of SMEs today, which have the great benefit on this money. And eventually for Africa, the focus will lie on families, on small units, on smallest units in the first phase. My pillar number 3, the climate agenda. I want to make it short because this globally highly complex topic needs much stronger developments than there are already existing under the Africa-EU Innovation Alliance for Water and Climate, which is working in the Cordis research of the EU. I am sure that if any pact can be agreed upon, the green agenda will automatically be a dominating one, carried by Africa and Europe at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, hoping that I have referred to the key factors from my view and sight, the factors of consideration to create a win-win situation for Africa and Europe, I want to make clear that it is carried by a great optimism. Everybody knows, and I am not ashamed of, because all other approaches have failed in the past. So looking forward that such an event will next time happen personally and face-to-face and eyes-to-eyes, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for these interesting points. I will now give words to Mr. Duarte.
The sound. Good afternoon all. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'll be quite brief in my presentation concerning mostly the threats coming from the south flank of the Mediterranean. And talking about the south flank, I'm talking about the Maghreb, the Sahel, and the western coast of Africa. So I will talk about the threats to having in account concerning the south flank of Mediterranean, and most of all, how should NATO deal with those threats? So, but first thing first, let's go to a concept that refers the idea of a south flank of the Mediterranean. And what south are we talking about? Because here we need to redefine the center of gravity concerning NATO objectives, because Mediterranean is also a center of gravity. Of course, NATO has a well-established partnership program, the so-called Mediterranean Dialogue, embracing North Africa and the Levant. It was initiated about almost 30 years ago with Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Mauritania, Morocco. But this approach to the idea of south flank of Mediterranean from NATO need or could imply challenges outside the normal and regular confrontation with Russia on the east side. So NATO should also consider the Mediterranean and its immediate hinterlands behind Maghreb, the Sahel, and the western coast of Africa. And of course, in the south there are crises, but no clear idea of a center of gravity in terms of security. So my point is quite simple. NATO should concern the center of gravity of the Mediterranean, first. Second, NATO also considers the south of Mediterranean, but does not consider the south of Mediterranean as a center of gravity in terms of security. So it should do that. And why? Because coming from the south of Mediterranean, I can identify at least 4 types of threats that could create disruption and create destabilization in North Atlantic and of course in Europe. The first type of threat is state failure. And of course, concerning state failure in the south flank of Mediterranean, in the hinterlands of the Maghreb, talking about Sahel and western coast of Africa, NATO should mitigate the consequences of security threats presented by some countries facing state failure and help partners addressing their governance challenges. This is crucial. And we can go 10 years ago to Arab Spring, the dynamics of the Middle East, the changing of power, the vacuum of power, that vacuum of power that could be occupied by other states, not only by other states, but also occupied by non-state actors. And of course, Libya, it's the perfect example of that. Mali is an example of that. Mauritania is an example of that. So take, for instance, we have a recent political upheaval in Mali and in the Ivory Coast that threatens to compound, intensifying instability in Sahel, and this could spill over into other Western African countries. Mali, large-scale protests in Bamako began in the opposition to corruption. Controversial election results and the government inability to quell the resurgence of militant activity. Mali. Burkina Faso, militant activity began spilling over from Mali 3 years ago to northern parts of Burkina Faso. But soon, I know it's not new to say that, but soon they will spread throughout Burkina Faso, destabilizing the country and creating a new basis for militant attacks into neighboring countries like Benin and also all the parts of Ivory Coast. So we are talking about attacks, kidnappings, and other insurgents operations that have killed right now thousands. So you are having right now a violence problem and also a refugee problem. So behind Burkina Faso, behind Mali, behind Benin, we have Niger. And you have militant attacks that also killed more people in the first 6 months of 2020 than in all 2019. So the country, like Burkina Faso, like Mali, faces spillover violence from 2 fronts. One, from the insurgents that are based in Mali, in Burkina Faso, on its west side, and from the insurgents that are based in Nigeria to its southeast flank. So once more, Mali, Burkina Faso, Benin, Ivory Coast, and Niger. So all of them, they are behind an increasement of the violence. You have what we have here in common. Structural weaknesses of these governments that will leave them vulnerable to bouts of political unrest, in of disruption, and you have in common an endemic corruption, abuses committed by various security forces, and of course the pandemics and the COVID-19 have compounded the adverse impacts of the insurgence. So the first vector of the first type of threat that we have in south flank of the Mediterranean, in the hinterlands of the Maghreb and the Sahel, it's state failure. It's a threat that NATO should do. Second one, it's probably more obvious for NATO, which is a more and more assertive Russia in the South Mediterranean flank and also in Africa. So Russian Federation has been NATO's traditional eastern flank challenger. It's not new, but right now Moscow military deployments in Syria since September 2015 made NATO revisit Russia's role in relation to the southern flank as well. I'm talking about Mediterranean, east part of the Mediterranean. The point is, Moscow seeks more access and freedom of movement in the Mediterranean region and is bolstering its military footprint to achieve this objective. It's not new, it's part of Putin's international strategy for Russia, of course. So, but right now Russia seems to believe it can be more successful in projecting power and minimizing the influence of NATO and European countries. Take, for instance, Russia have a long-standing relationship with Algeria. Right now, a strong relationship in Libya, most of it with Khalifa Haftar, and is reviving the security relationship with Egypt, and has remained as an influential political actor from the Balkans to the Levant. So all the eastern part of the Mediterranean, from Algeria to Libya to Egypt to the Levant to the Balkans, is being controlled progressively by Russia. Of course, Syrian crisis provided the Kremlin with a front door to return to a region that has always been a geostrategical relevance for its foreign projection, since Egypt ordered out Soviet forces in 1972. 3 years ago, Russia announced the formation of a permanent group of forces at the port of Tartus in Syria and nearby the Khmeimim air base. So Moscow is funding about 500 million in expansion, and this will provide Russian warships with greater capacity for sustained and more distance operation in all the Mediterranean Sea. So I'm talking about the Eastern Mediterranean because they are developing a strong capability that allows them to control not only the Levant or the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but the western part of Mediterranean, and probably going to the hinterlands. So in eastern Libya, Moscow might hope that its air power and the mercenary forces, including the Wagner, will gain sway with future rulers there. And this could involve Libyan, of course, warlord Khalifa Haftar or other power brokers, you name it, other power brokers such as the Emirates, for instance, because they also support Khalifa Haftar. So in May last year, the AFRICOM said that 14 unmarked jet fighters and Su-24 fighter bombers were deployed in eastern Libya, which is now being transformed into a long-term Russian bastion. Another point interesting for Russia in eastern Mediterranean and the south flank of Mediterranean, it's energy. Because there is a potential for access to an energy jackpot in the eastern Mediterranean, perhaps partially for the reason the Kremlin has increased support to the Libyan National Army, and of course the tension with Turkey and with Russia. So Libya is a part of a tension between Turkey and Russia is betting to control a significant part of the oil that goes directly to the south part of the Mediterranean. So All these Mediterranean activities complement Russia's much larger military build-up in Crimea, and it will give Moscow a great capacity to strike targets in the Black Sea and even in the Middle East. But concerning Africa, Kremlin, it's not new. Take, for instance, what is happening in North Mozambique, in Congo. Kremlin is increasing the presence in that area. And right now they are trying to sort of a revival of the Soviet presence in Africa. So right now Kremlin is increasing presence, arms sales, security pacts, and training programs in Africa, most in sub-Saharan Africa. And for now, 5 sub-Saharan Africans in western coast of Africa, just like Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania, appealed to Moscow in 2018, 2 years ago, to help their overtaxed militaries and security forces to combat jihadi insurgency against Islamic State, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda. So what I'm saying is that there is a sort of a security vacuum that the Russians could take advantage on it. So as long as the US and France right now concerning Sahel and Western African countries are withdrawing in that area, the Russians are taking advantage of it. So first threat, state failure. Second threat, a more assertive Russia in South Mediterranean flank and the Western coast and all Africa. Third threat, radical and violent non-state actors in Maghreb and Sahel. So if we take a look at the media, you will probably understand that there is a sort of an apparent coordinated jihadi campaign in Sahel. So right now, Sahel has emerged as a primary global hotspot for militancy, where Al-Qaeda and Daesh have both established strong branches. And these jihadi groups will further undermine the security of the Sahel countries and pose an increasing threat to coastal West African countries. As the security environment continues to deteriorate, various governments and international organizations have warned that militancy could further destabilize governments, spill over into neighboring countries, just like I said, and even pose a threat to Western countries. What we have here, 1, Al-Qaeda and Daesh affiliates that they are reportedly or apparently cooperating in the Sahel, making a new trend in an ever worsening security environment. Although this cooperation will increase pressure on regional government, does not indicate, so please mark my words, does not indicate a strategical level rapprochement between Al-Qaeda and Daesh. But their actions will shape the regional strategy of external players. So this is important concerning a possible cooperation from a tactical perspective between Al-Qaeda and Daesh, but not from a strategical perspective. So this will shape a regional strategy of external players. Then we have the Jamaat Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which is a wilayat from the Daesh. And initially they operated out of central Mali and northern Burkina Faso. But over the past years, increasingly violent and frequent militant attacks have begun affecting the Mali-Niger border area and the southern parts of Burkina Faso. The past year, more than almost 3,000 people have been killed and more than 500,000 have been displaced in Burkina Faso alone. So that is several cross-border attacks into the coastal West Africa and the precautionary measures taken by authorities underscore the risk that militant activity, which first spilled over from Mali into Burkina Faso, will spill over even more. And data indicates that the number of violent events in the Sahel linked to these militants descended from almost 150 in mid-2017 to almost 1,000 in mid-2020. So it's incredible. So it's obvious. It's a fact. So, and the even worsening situation will pose a potential threat to personnel and facilities in these countries, while successful attacks will undermine economic outlooks already clouded by the pandemics. So the jihadis have previously managed the attack to economic hubs in coastal West Africa and have called for additional attacks. Just take a look at their social media, take a look at their all their revendications. So they just made an appeal for additional attacks. And the most notable example came from the QIM, in Islamic Maghreb, when they attacked the Grand Bassam resort in the Ivory Coast 5 years ago, in 2016. An attack that undermined the country's tourism industry. Of course, we are thinking about the pandemics and all the tourism. So concerning pandemics, all the threats, they are far away in our imaginary. But the terrorism attacks in Western countries will affect the region tourism industry. But the primary threat will remain along these countries' northern borders, given the proximity to militant bases in Burkina Faso and Mali. And they have already been rare spillovers attacks to Benin, including an attack in May 2019 against 2 French tourists that were kidnapped, as well as in the Ivory Coast, which in June 2020 suffered the first jihadi attack since 2016.
Okay.
Ivory Coast, which might be the more vulnerable country due to recent political upheavals, political riots, political instability, established a military zone on its northern border with Burkina Faso, while Senegal built a new military camp on its border with Mali.
I'm sorry, but to interrupt, we have to round up.
So the point is here that you have a sort of an almost anecdotal evidence suggests that these countries like Ghana, Togo, and Benin have also ramped up security measures along their northern borders. So summing up, you have 4 types of threats: state failure, it's Russia presence, militancy, and the 4th one, which I will say in 30 seconds, which is hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare, it's a threat that requires a multidimensional strategies to territorial defense, cooperative security, and crisis management. So hybrid warfare is when you have a combination of conventional and unconventional means. The Russians call it non-linear warfare. And so in hybrid warfare, you might have in that area a possibility of 1, proxy warfares between Russia, Turkey, for instance, a progressive presence of different non-state actors, narrative-led operations, and the permanent insurgents. So I don't have enough time to talking about the importance of hybrid threats in that area, but in the Q&A session, if you want, I can talk about it. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry for the 2 minutes.
No problem. Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Mr. Uriarte.
You're on mute.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the invitation to the Institute, the German Institute for the Democracy. And well, let me a little bit talk from our point of view. I mean, I'm coming from Spain. Then for us also, this region is quite well known. And of course, we are also concerned about the situation in not only just in North Africa, but in the whole continent, and especially in the region of the Sahel, because many of the problems that they are having nowadays in North Africa, they are coming as well from Sahel. I mean, because, for example, if we put the example of Libya, as you mentioned, Professor Felipe Duarte, is a failed state. And I mean, there are not controls of borders at all in the south of Libya. And then for this reason, there are a lot of flows of refugees, immigrants, but of course also jihadists. They can come through the south part of Libya, coming from Sahel, because there are not controls at all in the borders. And the borders in the region of Sahel, they are, in reality, they are not borders controls at all. And for this reason, this is one of the main problems. If we think, for example, in the case of Morocco, well, Morocco now has a monarchy, a stable monarchy. It's an stable country, but you never know what can happen in the future, because also the non-moderate parties, they are taking more and more power in Morocco as well, little by little. And of course, there is always a danger of radicalization also, even in Morocco. And we know what is happening now in Algeria, and the changes in Algeria, with a president very long time ill, and well, a country that we don't know what is going to happen in the future. And now the problems among Morocco and Algeria in with regard the long time issue of the Western Sahara. I mean, now the whole North Africa is also in a crossroad, of course, with some better situations, like, for example, in Tunisia. But in Tunisia, even we don't know if this situation, they started with a democracy, with a new constitution, new elections, but it's also very fragile, Tunisia. We don't know what is happening in the future with Tunisia. Well, and the neighbors from the south, they are even more unstable, more, they are, most of them, a failed state, and many of them, they still survive as countries with the support of the international community. We must think, for example, that Mali would be a failed state if the European Union was not present there, and especially also the French troops, which are without the support of France, and a little bit with the support of Spain and some other European Union countries, Mali would be nowadays a failed state. And for this reason, we must focus our attention and pay attention on the situation of this region, because, well, because we have, as Europeans, also a responsibility, not only in the Saheli region, but in the whole Africa. And of course, for us, the main important issue regarding this region is security, but it's not only just security. We need to give them, to these countries, also prospects, good prospects of development, to build capabilities, state capabilities, to create and build institutions. I mean, to try to give them support to be states, as we can understand. But additionally, they need also financial support, and they need also economical prospects. Because if we don't give them support, then many of their citizens, especially the young people, these countries in the Sahel area, they are mostly young people. If they don't have any prospects, they want to come to Europe. I mean, to the north. And in this regard, we must work with them strong. I mean, and but for this reason, we need as well a common immigration policy in the European Union. Because if we don't work with a common approach, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, we must work with the origin countries. We must work as well with the transit countries and also with the countries of origin. And well, of course, the European Union approved a strategy, but a strategy in 2016 that, in my opinion, this strategy should be renovated. In this strategy, there were different priorities. That I could summarize in 4 key themes. The first one was that security and development in the Sahel cannot be separated, and that helping these countries achieve security is integral to enabling their economics to growth and poverty to be reduced. Secondly, that achievement, security and development in the Sahel is only possible through closer regional cooperation. This is currently weaker than it needs to be, and the European Union has a potential role to play in supporting it. Thirdly, all the states of the region will benefit from considerable capacity building, both in areas of core government activity, including the provisions of security and development cooperation. And fourthly, that the European Union, therefore, has an important role to play both in encouraging economic development for the people of the Sahel and helping them achieve a more secure environment in which it can take place and in which the interests of European Union citizens are also protected. I mean, as you mentioned, the challenges are very high. There are also third actors, like as you mentioned before. We could summarize in the influences of Russia in the region, the influence of course, of China. China is everywhere in Africa as well. Also countries that they try to influence these countries to, in terms of radicalization, like for example, Turkey and the Emirates, they try also to influence over these countries. There is also, of course, the role of USA, but the USA is not anymore so present as in the past. When Felipe mentioned the role of NATO, okay, the problem of the NATO is that NATO doesn't have a mandate for this region, as you know. And even Ceuta and Melilla is not covered by the NATO treaty. And these are the 2 Spanish cities, which are 2 European cities in the north of Morocco. And even Ceuta and Melilla, they are not covered at all by the NATO treaty. Then imagine the Sahel. Of course, we should try to join forces among the European Union and maybe a renew NATO agenda, but it's not inside the treaty. Then I'm not so optimistic that the NATO could cover this part of Africa. I mean, it would be a possibility, but I'm not optimistic at all now in this moment. And then we have the influence of three actors, countries, the influence of jihadist groups, and the problem of their these own countries, that they are not stable at all, that they are failed states, and so on. And it's important to have a common approach to find a solution for these countries. We have this 5-group, Sahel 5-group, to try to have a regional approach and to work with the 5 countries as a European Union with a common approach to these 5 countries. But we must try to invest more money, to invest more efforts there. We must to coordinate ourselves better as Europeans in this region, because our security is in danger if we don't do this. And as well, these people, the people of these countries, they need also prospects for a better future. This is our duty, this is our responsibility as well as Europeans. I'm a little bit more optimistic now, for example, in the regard that, well, Jean-Claude Juncker introduced the so-called Africa Plan. And, well, the Africa Plan had very good words, but in the end, the economic crisis, the social crisis due to the pandemic, the COVID-19 came, and I'm not sure what is going to happen with this money, because of course we need this money for the recovery plan for Europe first. But anyhow, the Portuguese presidency has put on the center of the Portuguese presidency Africa as an important point for the Portuguese presidency, and they want to organize this African European Union African Union summit before the end of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union. Then we must wait what is going to happen. Also, the agreement, the treaty of Cotonou was renewed, and I mean there are more approaches, more positive approaches to Africa in the European Union policy. But I think that there is still a long way to the point that we should arrive. And we are doing things, but very slowly. And the problem is that the problems in the Sahel, they are not slowly, and they are increasing more and more. And this is a problem that we must face as Europeans if we don't want to have problems in the future. I mean, we must remember the terror attacks in Casablanca, or other, well, the terror attacks in Madrid, in Barcelona, in London. And I mean, if we don't be responsible for our own security, we cannot be safe. I mean, for this reason, we must try to do the best as soon as possible. And well, I could speak more about the region, but also my colleagues, they speak also long. Then I'm going to stop, and so maybe after we can have a little bit dialogue among us. Also, sorry for my delay to join us, and thank you very much also for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your explanation as well. We will now move on to the last speaker, Mr. Martins.
Hi, hello. I would like to summarize more or less what the previous speaker said. I understood that, and it's understandable that the situation in Sahel is very worrying for the European Union at large, because of the security, because of the Southern Union. It's very interesting what Professor Duarte said about this different center of gravity from NATO. it's very important, and it's very interesting to see that taking the challenges for the European member states, moving from, not necessarily from the east, but also from the south, it would be interesting for NATO to start tackling that as well, despite it's not an easy path, as you know, and despite the fact it takes lots of considerations, especially those who are members of NATO. I would also like to point out the situation, the pillars that Mr. Becker mentioned. And one of the pillars, the education offensive, the economic cooperation, and the financial aid. But there is one thing that is very important that also is linked to what Professor Duarte said about the climate agenda and about the fact that if we have problems in the south, who suffers more, it will be the south of Europe as well. And with failed states, with unstable situations, with something that it was not mentioned, which is this basically combination of the role of Europe with former colonies such as Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and others. So what is the role for Europe? Do we want to be very much involved? Again, as Professor Duarte said, the priorities were set in 2016. They are already passed by time and by challenges. So we have to consider ourselves. We think it's very good that the EU presidency has included Africa, and obviously for historical reasons, the role of Portugal and its previous colonies in Africa, it's very important for Portugal to keep this idea of linking Europe to Africa. It's very important to redefine what we want, what we see, and how can we support. Because supporting is not only about giving money, but supporting is also understanding the local challenge to benefit the local people, and at the same time to benefit the Europeans and the safety of not only the Europeans, but also the Africans. So the situation will be, what I would like to basically to conclude is that sometimes we fail to understand these situations because, and Mr. Becker knows it well, the politicians have to decide fast and quick and say everything in a couple of minutes. And the situations are much more deeper and much more complicated than they look. And the actors are much more vast than they look as well. So it's important to keep debating and to keep presenting these issues permanently in EU level, especially in Brussels. And it's important also to create a global alliance that can make solve some of these particular issues. I especially welcome the situation in Libya, for instance, that despite the many attempts to create alliances and dialogue between the parties, the situation is still very dangerous and very much on the border. But we have to keep trying this dialogue, and we have to keep trying basically to create feasible solutions for all the parties. Thank you.
We can now have a few questions. I have one to start maybe. So Trump's administration had taken a toll on the usual cooperation with the EU and NATO, and now President Biden has declared that he will repair the NATO alliance. Can we expect Europe, can Europe actually expect that Biden's leadership will cause a significant shift with the US foreign policy regarding the situation?
I mean, first of all, I think that as Europeans, we must be happy that Biden won the elections. I mean, in this regard, Trump thought so much in America first. I mean, maybe Trump was a good president for Americans, but I'm not so sure if he was a good American president for the whole world. Because, I mean, we as Europeans, we are much in favor of multilateralism. And in this regard, I mean, we need a USA which advocates for multilateralism as well, to work together for common challenges that, of course, we share values. Europe and USA, we are common of a Western civilization, and in this regard, we support in both parts of the Atlantic rule of law, human dignity, and democracy. But I mean, Biden, I think that multilateralism in this regard, I'm optimistic, but Americans, they must do big efforts to recover Europeans again confidence, because the confidence among the two parts of the Atlantic was a little bit broken in the last 5 years. And even if they commit themselves as before with Europe, we must as Europeans be also responsible of our own security. And in this regard, I agree of the concept of strategic autonomy. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a strategic autonomy or, as the Germans, they prefer saying sovereignty, autonomy, or sovereign autonomy, or in the end, what we need is that we must be responsible of our own future and our own capabilities for security and defense, but of course, always in cooperation with NATO, always in cooperation with NATO. But inside the NATO, we need to have also an European accent. I mean, we need to have also an European influence as Europe in the NATO agenda. And in this regard, we must try to check and balance as well among the eastern flank, where the Baltic state and Poland, they have a lot of interest in this flank, but also we must focus our priorities in the southern flank of Europe, where maybe Portuguese, Spanish, and Italians, they are more afraid, no? I mean, in the end, we must try to have a common approach, a common concept of a common security for all Europe, and we must try to find a balance. But the transatlantic link, it's very important for Europeans, and we are not be enough prepared to be independent in our security in a short time, and we must be conscious of that. Okay, thank you.
I would like to complement what Professor Duarte said. But basically, for the European Union, you have different options and different choices. The first choice is, do we really want the Americans to be the single police of the world? Secondly, do we want to invest in security as member states only, or as a whole? And that is, if we want to do it as a whole, how do we want to do it? Only via the EU, or via the EU and NATO, or only via NATO? So these are questions that we have to answer ourselves first. And we have to consider, on the top of this, the dynamics that we are facing today. We have the pandemic. Nobody knows what is going to happen in terms of financially and economically for the world after the pandemic has gone, or has moving away a little bit. This will be dramatic for the economies of the member states. So Do we have the money to put on the top of these in security issues, in security challenges? We have to ask ourselves this question. Do the Americans, despite the new attitude by the Biden administration, have the will and the financial will to do that? We don't know neither. So what we have to understand is basically, I think we have to make choices, to make options, and then to see what we want to do and what we can do. These are the two things that we have to leverage, basically, in my view.
Yes, let me just only say one or two things, quite simple. Yes, what Carlos and Nuno said, it's obvious. So, but the point is, we as Europeans, we need to manage the question of hope. And what I'm saying is, to manage the question of hope is that after Trump, we have hope for everything. And so we need to manage that. We need to manage our expectations concerning the crucial transatlantic relation, crucial for Europe, crucial for open societies, and crucial for Western countries. So first, transatlantic relationship is crucial. Second, European Union should deal very well the expectations with hope. Why? Because after Trump, everything is a question of hope. And right now, in this week, we have a very interesting episode, which sometimes can give us hope, at the same time reveals a quite pragmatic approach of Joe Biden, which is the attack on Syria, on the Iranian militias in Syria border. So this is a very direct message of Joe Biden. So we need to, I think that episode reveals what the Europeans should expect of a Democrat administration of Joe Biden. So a pragmatic approach, a realistic approach, and above all, a consequence approach. But concerning those three topics, we need to deal with our hopes and not think that after Trump, everything is our relation is paved with gold. No, it's not. And so Biden will have a realistic and a pragmatic approach to all problems. And of course, talking about Africa, there are lots of Africas and lots of different strategies for Africa. But concerning the West Coast and the Maghreb, I do think and I expect the Americans should intervene a little bit more, because the vacuum of security left by France, because French, they are dealing right now to withdraw all the forces in the Chad, or a significant part of the forces in the Chad. So that absence of Western presence and the vacuum of security will be immediately fulfilled by different players. And we will have a strategic loss with that. So I do think and I do expect that the Americans, of course, this Biden administration, definitely linked and in cooperation European Union, should have a more strong presence in the western coast of Africa and in the Sahel.
Oh, Joko, you're
Yeah.
muted. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. We also have a contribution from Mr. Becker as well.
Thank you very much. I'm listening this very, very detailed analysis by Mr. Duarte and Mr. Sanchez. As you have a very clear expertise on the local, even local happenings wherever in the region. So what I want to focus is that also my conviction, as I told you, is that parallel to any cooperation model with the African continent or with the Sub-Sahara, Sahel, West African region, as I have described with the three pillars, parallel to that, we need a clearly security solution which only can be military-wise. There is no other option. knowing that we have now much better conditions in forming such an offensive on military level, I want to focus on the very sensitive situation for the national governments and administrations in Africa, which are influenced by the Russians, by the Chinese, where only France, as the only power, could intervene in the past. And even they, the French people, were not supported clearly by other partners from Europe, and for sure not by the NATO or whatever. So knowing that we have no European support for the French, we have no American support in the past, we have great power challenges with Russia and China to expect, and which might make it very difficult for national administrations in the West African area, Sub-Sahara, Sahel, to cooperate with us. I think that there is, in fact, the hope that the new transatlantic connection between Europe and USA could help, that we could manage a UN mandate. I don't think that a NATO mandate under American lead alone would solve the great interdependencies in these regions between all powers of the globe. And so I do not know any solution, but this is the track I would recommend and advise our people to go, to look for a UN mandate in the next step. As you may know, there is a working process going on in Europe by all the three institutions of EU. It's the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. At the same time, it will come together to one great event on the future of Europe. And I'm very much interested to think of what could be the result on what was already discussed as a separate European defense alliance, which should not disturb our NATO relations, but should be what was said, the, let's say, independent European pillar for defense and security. So I'm looking forward to know what will be at the end remaining from that great idea, because a paper and maybe some manifesto or whatever it will be, which will be the future of Europe, must give answer to the question how to treat the unbelievable vulnerability of this African continent, which directly affects European security. So I'm looking forward. It will be this year which will show us this, because as I obviously can agree with among all of us, we all think that military actions will be necessary. Thank you.
Thank you for your response. Edo, do you have a question?
Yes, I had a small question on what are your thoughts on, well, the European Union has quite high values in regards to human rights, and in cooperating with other countries and yeah, participating in other regions. In which way do you think that those values have to be respected by those countries? Or should it be a way to, yeah, should it be a way to help those values develop more? Or should it not be used therefore?
Yes, Mr.
Heinz?
Becker, I think.
I just want want to reflect very shortly. Saying that we need a clear partnership makes no sense to missionize again in a way of the historic responsibility Europe has on the shoulders. So what we can do is to deal in partnership. And knowing what this meant in the past, partnership with China or with the Soviet Union or various other regions in the world who never fulfilled our European human rights agenda, I know that we again, and we may cry upon it, but we have to accept, we must go step by step. Confidence, support, partnership, and maybe then whenever we will have a chance to missionize our values to the world. But to make it very formally, our forwarding European values everywhere is part of the EU policy, clearly described as we have the must to do so. But of course, pragmatically, I told you we have to go step by step.
I have nothing to say about this question. Thank you very much, because I think Heinz said everything.
Okay, thank you. I maybe have one more question as well. How is the European Union or the other parties addressing the COVID-19 situation? Are there any special measures in the region? Yes.
In the region. Well, in the Sahel region, or
yes.
in Europe?
Yes, in the Sahel region.
I mean, I think that we are not still giving so much support because even I have heard that until in some countries they don't arrive until the 80% of the inhabitants, that the European inhabitants in some countries, for example, in Spain, they want to arrive until the 80% of the population, until they consider that the situation is more or less under control with the vacuums. Then I'm not sure what we are going outside our borders, but I think that in this moment we are not helping so much with vacuums in this part. And this is also a problem because the Chinese, they are doing. And well, we should be careful because Chinese, they are very intelligent to use vacuum campaigns in favor of him to improve its image in the world. But well, in Europe, we started at the beginning with a lot of problems of coordination because there were different approaches and visions for the regard of how to fight against the COVID and how to manage everything. But little by little, the European Commission has taken good coordination in this regard. And I think that, for example, to buy the vacuums, I think this coordination way was very positive to show the solidarity among Europeans and how the European Union could face the pandemic in a common way, buying together vacuums. Because what we couldn't have more inside the European Union is a lack of solidarity among Europeans, because this is not good for the European integration process. And but I think that we are not supporting too much now with vacuums in this part of the world, but because there is a lack of vacuum everywhere. But anyhow, the Chinese, they are trying to support with vacuums in a very low price, or more or less giving like gifts to people, to some especially poor countries, and we should be careful with this kind of policies that they are other countries they are doing. But I mean, it's also true that the impact of COVID is not so strong in Africa as in other continents. I mean, as we are now having in Europe, or even in USA, or in Latin America. In Latin America, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Peru, in Colombia, the rates of COVID has been higher than in Africa, with the exception of South Africa, or a little bit also Morocco, because they are countries with tourists, especially Morocco or Tunisia. But in Sahel, there were not so many cases of COVID as in other parts of the world. This is my opinion.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Maybe I can give a short contribution on that.
Yes, sure.
I've recently studied this question. What is Europe doing versus neighbors who very often suffer of much bigger social problems and health problems than we do? But it has a logic. But the reply was one which sounds cynically, but it is a logical one. Europe, the EU, had committed to forward vaccines after European demand is covered. And they will do that even free of charge to anywhere in the world where it's needed, such as Africa, wherever. But after European needs are fulfilled. So that's very clear. All other steps would never get the agreement by European citizens.
Okay, thank you. Edo, do you have a question?
I wanted to ask whether, maybe the attendees who have now joined the panel as well, if they have a question, feel free to ask as well. Or otherwise, I think it's about time to wrap up. If that's all right for everyone, or if someone has something to say. So yeah, we wanted to thank you then again for these very interesting speeches. The event has been recorded as well, so we'll publish it on YouTube, or it can be watched back on Facebook Live. And we'll also make a podcast out of it. So you can, we'll provide all the links to your emails as well. Yes, and then as a short conclusion, we have a few other webinars coming up as well. So this Friday, we have a webinar on combating terrorism and radicalization in the EU.
And the vice president of the European Parliament is joining, so might be interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And two experts as well, also on artificial intelligence. So we're looking forward to that. And that, I think, kind of concludes it.